High in the Himalayas, where the mountains tower like ancient guardians of stone, the line between beauty and danger is razor thin. The peaks are majestic, breathtaking in their scale, yet merciless in their ability to swallow even the strongest of men. Many who come here seek adventure, a challenge, or perhaps even enlightenment. But for some, what begins as a journey of discovery turns into a desperate fight against nature itself. This is the story of James Scott, a young Australian medical student whose planned week-long trek in December 1991 would spiral into one of the most harrowing survival tales ever recorded in the Himalayas. To understand James' journey, we must go back to September of the year before. In 1990, James, only 22 years old at the time, wrote to a hospital in Nepal. His hope was to complete part of his medical elective there, combining his passion for medicine with his curiosity about the world. The hospital never replied, but James refused to let silence stand in his way. By the following year, he had already booked a flight, convinced his friend Tim Hooper to join him, and prepared to take a leap into the unknown. Fate, however, has a way of rewarding determination. Just days before departure, a letter finally arrived, confirming his placement. At this stage in life, James seemed unstoppable. He was thriving in his studies, engaged to be married, and in peak physical condition. Beyond medicine, he loved the outdoors. He hiked, he cycled, and he practiced karate at a national level. He wasn't just a casual student of the martial art, he had earned his black belt and even competed in tournaments. All of this built into a sense of confidence, a feeling that he could overcome almost any challenge. Though his hospital work wouldn't begin until December, James flew to Nepal in September. He wanted to settle in early to get his bearings in a foreign country. The hospital staff quickly picked up on his love for the outdoors and encouraged him to explore the Himalayas. While James was not a climber, he actually had a fear of heights. Hiking was different. He enjoyed the rhythm of it, the steady challenge of putting one foot in front of the other. The Jum Trail seemed like the perfect place to start. James and Tim prepared with care. They gathered gear, packed supplies, and even hired 2 porters and a guide. Their first trek was approached with caution, but also excitement. The journey took them to elevations of nearly 9,800 feet, where the air thinned and the cold nipped at their skin. The scenery was unlike anything they had ever seen. Towering peaks, deep valleys, and a silence that seemed to stretch forever. Yet surprisingly, the cold was not as severe as they had feared. Other trekkers passed them lightly dressed in ski jackets and sneakers, which made James and Tim feel almost comical with their heavy preparations. Within days, their confidence grew. They sent the porters and guide back to Kathmandu, choosing to continue on their own with only what they could carry on their backs. For several more days they pressed forward, and when they finally returned to the city, the sense of accomplishment was overwhelming. Their first Himalayan adventure had been a success. And with success came something dangerous: confidence. They were so encouraged by their first experience that they began planning a second trek before James' hospital assignment even started. This time, they believed, they knew what to expect. They thought they understood the mountains, their moods, and their challenges. What they did not realize was just how drastically different December would be from the milder September conditions of their first journey. Their earlier preparations, thicker gear, heavier supplies, would have been perfectly suited for winter. But past success had made them bold. Overconfidence, as it so often does in the mountains, would come at a cost. Their next destination was the Helembu Trail. It was more difficult, but offered lodges along the way where food and shelter could be found. This time, they packed light. Everything they carried had to fit into their rucksacks. James's belongings reflected a mindset that was still focused more on comfort than survival. 10 pairs of underwear, a few t-shirts, thermal layers, pants, a sweatshirt, a light jacket, a towel, his camera, and 4 books to read by the fire at night. It was enough for a hike, but not nearly enough for the unforgiving bite of a Himalayan winter. On December 21st, they began their second trek. That first evening, they stayed in a lodge where they encountered a group of German hikers who had just returned from Hilambu. The Germans told them that the trail wasn't especially difficult, but also not particularly rewarding. Their words planted a seed of doubt in James and Tim's minds. James pulled out his map, a worn and outdated version of Nepal's terrain. The Germans noticed and, taking pity on them, offered their own more detailed and accurate map. With this new chart in hand, James and Tim spotted something intriguing: the Gosaikund Trail, an alternate route branching off from Hilambu that wasn't marked on their original map. The next morning, energized by the prospect of exploring something new, they set out early. Along the way, they met another traveler, Mark Fulton, a solo hiker from Australia. His accent was familiar, and within minutes the three had struck up an easy camaraderie. Mark had planned to hike Hilambu as well, but James and Tim, after hearing the Germans' lackluster review of the route, persuaded him to join them on the Gosaikund Trail instead. The three pressed forward together, but before long, trouble struck. Tim injured his leg. He tried to carry on, but the pain forced him to stop. Realizing he couldn't continue, he told James he would turn back to Kathmandu. James offered to return with him, but Tim insisted he go on with Mark. Deep down, Tim could see the excitement in his friend's eyes, the desire to keep moving forward. They promised to reunite on Christmas Eve at their favorite restaurant in Kathmandu. But in the rushed exchange, a costly mistake was made. James accidentally handed Tim the newer, more accurate map, leaving himself with the outdated one. And Tim, perhaps distracted by the situation, forgot to return their only lighter. Neither of them realized in that moment how critical these small details would become. James and Mark continued without him, setting up camp that night at an elevation of nearly 9,800 feet. The following day, they reached the village of Tharapati, the junction where the Gosaikund Trail split away from the main path. There, they encountered trekkers returning from the route. When asked about conditions, the group admitted it was tough, but assured them it was still passable. The snow had not yet closed in. For James, it was enough reassurance to keep moving forward. And with that choice, he unknowingly stepped deeper into the trial of his life. Reassured by the lodgekeeper's calm words, James and Mark pressed on toward the next stop on their journey. At first, there was nothing to fear. But when morning came, the mountain revealed a different face. A thin dusting of snow lay quietly across the ground, and overhead the clouds gathered, heavy and dark, promising trouble. They asked once more about the weather, hoping for guidance. The lodgekeeper assured them that no snow was expected, that the pass ahead would be fine, and that they could continue safely. Comforted, the two men left at around 7:30 in the morning. The trail was clear, the air sharp, and for a time the views were breathtaking. Distant peaks glowing under the morning light, valleys stretching endlessly below. It seemed like the kind of day that would be etched into memory forever. Yet as they climbed, the weather shifted. Slowly at first, then suddenly, the mountain closed in on them. Temperatures dropped. The sky thickened with swirling gray. And then, without warning, heavy snow began to fall. The flakes were large, soft at first, but within moments they became blinding. They fell thick and fast, reducing visibility to almost nothing. In no time, the trail vanished beneath their boots. 5 inches of snow swallowed the path, erasing every landmark and bending the landscape into a white void. James felt a rising unease. The thought crept into his mind that they should turn back before the storm worsened. But before he could speak, the storm played its cruel trick. The 2 men became separated, caught on different sides of a swollen creek. The sound of rushing water drowned their voices, and the snowfall made it nearly impossible to see. For 15 long minutes they shouted, calling into the void, hoping to hear each other's voice. At last, against the storm's roar, they reunited. James voiced his concerns. He was worried, convinced that pressing forward would be too dangerous. Mark, however, remained steady and confident. He believed he could still navigate to Kathmandu despite the storm. The 2 men disagreed, and with a heavy heart, James made his choice. Despite Mark's disappointment, he turned back toward the safety of the lodge. Mark continued forward alone, vanishing into the snow. James began retracing his steps, but almost immediately he realized how quickly the storm had consumed the trail. The snow erased everything behind them, and now the world was unrecognizable. Visibility shrank to less than 30 feet. What once were familiar ridges and valleys were now blank canvases of white. He was lost. Desperate, he decided to follow a nearby creek, reasoning that water always led somewhere, perhaps to the village of Talou marked on his map. For hours he trudged along the banks, the icy water his only guide. But as the day stretched on, the valley narrowed, and sheer cliffs rose like walls around him. At last, the creek ended abruptly, crashing downward in a roaring waterfall nearly 100 feet high. James stood at the edge, staring down at the abyss below. There was no way forward. His choices were bleak. Going back meant wandering blind into the storm again. Forward meant climbing. He was not a climber, but survival left no other option. He pressed his palms to the slick rock, searching for holds, inch by inch forcing himself upward. Each ledge was wet, every grip uncertain, his fingertips clinging desperately. For 2 hours he climbed, dragging his body up the cliff face, never certain if the next slip would send him tumbling to his death. And then, at last, he pulled himself onto the top. Collapsing into the snow, exhausted but alive, he lay there shivering. A rocky overhang offered just enough shelter from the storm, and he crawled beneath it. Remembering his medical training, he knew the greatest threat now was not exhaustion, but hypothermia. The solution was counterintuitive. He stripped off his soaked clothes, used a towel to dry himself, and changed into whatever dry layers he had left. Cold and dry, he told himself, was safer than cold and wet. Curling into his sleeping bag beneath the overhang, James endured the night. At dawn, he pushed forward once more. Another creek caught his eye, and he chose to follow it, clinging to the logic that water must lead to life. But the snow was deep, heavy, and every step was a battle. After 2 hours of laboring, he had covered less than a single kilometer. The gully walls rose on both sides, slick with ice, making escape impossible. Again and again he tried to climb out, only to slide back down, bruised and spent. By late afternoon, exhausted and freezing, he gave up. He crawled beneath another overhang, repeating the ritual of drying himself and changing clothes. But this time, something was wrong. His feet were numb, his shivering worse than before. He knew the signs. His body was shutting down. That night was darker than the last. The cold sank into his bones. A creeping despair settled over him. For the first time, James believed he would not survive. Reaching into his pack, he pulled out a pen and notebook. His hands shook as he began to write. A farewell to his family, an apology for putting them through this pain, and words he feared they would never hear. He tucked the notebook away, lay down in his sleeping bag, and prepared himself for the end. Far away, back in Brisbane, December 29th arrived, 5 days after James was meant to return for dinner with his friend Tim. His sister, Joanne Robertson, received the call that shattered everything. Her husband answered first, then came downstairs to speak with her. Tim had sent a fax. James was missing. Joanne's heart broke as panic seized her. She wanted to fly to Nepal immediately to find her brother herself. But the Australian Foreign Affairs Department urged patience. They advised her to wait and to reach out to Carl Harrison, a mountaineering expert in Kathmandu, who could begin the search. The following day, Carl and his team set out into the mountains, while James's family endured the slow torture of waiting. They held on to hope, imagining he might be stranded in a lodge, safe and waiting for the storm to pass. But days slipped by without word. A group of French-Canadian trekkers reported seeing a lone hiker matching James's description. The search team believed with near certainty that it was him. Joanne rushed to tell her parents the hopeful news, but she could not sit idle any longer. The very next day, she secured her visa. On January 7th, she boarded a plane to Nepal. By then, James had been missing for 16 days. Those 16 days were a test of endurance few could imagine. James had attempted again and again to escape the mountains, but each time the snow pushed him back. His food supply had long since vanished, only 2 chocolate bars, gone within days. He survived on nothing but snow. His overhang of rock became his only home, his fragile refuge from the storms that raged endlessly. He had no fire, no warmth but his sleeping bag. He fought off the hunger with sleep, with reading, with anything to keep his mind from breaking. Yet the ache of emptiness never left him. He clung to life with nothing but willpower, waiting, hoping, praying that someone would come. After 2 weeks in the frozen Himalayas, the sharp agony of hunger dulled into a heavy emptiness, and James found himself relying on his karate training not just for discipline, but for survival of the mind. He began to walk through techniques in his head, rehearsing punches, stances, and breathing patterns. It became a kind of meditation, a mental exercise to keep him from slipping into despair. Each movement played out in his imagination was a tether holding him to sanity. But even this fragile focus was constantly threatened, and the worst distraction of all came from his feet. For days, he had not been able to feel them. No matter how hard he tried to massage warmth back into his toes, nothing worked. One day, pulling off his socks, he was horrified to see that both feet had turned completely blue. Panic surged through him. With trembling hands, he reached into his medical kit, pulled out a pair of dissection scissors, and stabbed into his own flesh. Blood oozed out, but he felt absolutely nothing. The realization that his feet might be dead, lost forever, settled over him like ice. Then, just when he thought things could not get worse, nature reminded him he was not truly alone. One afternoon, he was startled awake by a piercing scream echoing across the mountainside. Heart pounding, he looked up the slope and saw a bush violently shaking. A moment later, a massive black shape emerged from the shadows. It was a Himalayan black bear, heavy and menacing, a predator built to survive in the very environment that was slowly killing him. James stood frozen, gripping the only weapon he had, his scissors. In a desperate burst of defiance, he shouted at the bear, daring it to come down the slope. He even screamed at it to end his suffering, as if inviting death itself. But instead of charging, the beast turned and fled into the wilderness. That night, and for 5 more nights, James heard it circling nearby, its presence lingering in the darkness, a constant reminder that even in his isolation, danger was never far away. Meanwhile, far from the snow and silence of the mountains, the rescue efforts were unraveling. Several search teams had set out into the Himalayas, but each attempt was cut short by brutal snowstorms, uncharted terrain, or sheer exhaustion. The mountains swallowed their hopes the same way it had swallowed James. In Nepal, Joanne, his sister, felt the weight of helplessness pressing down on her. She desperately sought any lead, any scrap of information that might bring her closer to her brother. She tracked down a group of French-Canadian trekkers who claimed to have seen him. Most swore it was James, but one woman was not convinced. She remembered meeting a solo German trekker and believed he was the man mistaken for James. Her suspicion was confirmed when a letter from the German himself reached the search teams. The news crushed Joanne, snuffing out what little hope had flickered. By this point, James had been missing for 3 full weeks. Joanne's desperation deepened until she recalled a strange moment back at Kathmandu airport. A local woman had told her to seek guidance from a Buddhist Lama, a spiritual figure believed to see beyond the physical world. At the time, Joanne had dismissed it as superstition, but now, with nothing left to lose, she gave in. She met with the Lama, unrolled a map of the Himalayas, and told him James's story. After a quiet moment of prayer, the Lama placed his finger on a triangle of land bordered by the towns of Fiti, Gul, and Talu. He instructed her to send searchers there. Skeptics pointed out that the area had no real trails, no reason for James to be there, but the Lama was unwavering. Before she left, Joanne asked the most painful question of all: was her brother still alive? The Lama looked at her calmly and said, "You will see him again." At the same time, another problem loomed. Mark, the friend James had traveled with, had also vanished. With no word of his whereabouts, rescuers feared the mountains had claimed him too. But on January 15th, Mark finally called Joanne. He had made it out alive by following an alternate route to a village. Most importantly, he revealed that he and James had parted ways between Fiti and Gopi. That revelation changed everything. It meant James had likely gone southwest, straight into the very triangle of land the llama had pointed to weeks earlier. By then, James had been struggling alone in the snow for 30 days. His body was skeletal, his throat raw with infection, his mouth covered in ulcers. He was running on the faintest thread of strength. Then one day, a sound reached his ears that made his heart leap. At first, he thought it was the wind. But as the rhythm grew clearer, he realized it was a helicopter. Scrambling from his shelter, he waved his sleeping bag wildly, even pulling off layers to reveal his bright red long johns, hoping the color would stand out against the snow. He watched as the chopper circled, and then turned away. Gone. The crushing despair nearly broke him. He lay in the snow, skeletal, filthy, and nearly broken, contemplating whether this was how his life would end. But even as death crept into his thoughts, he imagined his family finding his frozen body, and the image kept him going. On day 42, another helicopter appeared. Summoning every ounce of energy left in him, James staggered to his feet, waving his sleeping bag with desperate vigor. For 20 minutes, he signaled until his body gave out and he collapsed into the snow. But this time, he felt certain he had been seen. He also knew that even if rescuers had spotted him, it could take days for them to reach him on foot. Days he might not survive. Back at rescue headquarters, Joanne kept vigil by the radio. Then it crackled to life. A voice came through, repeating the words she had longed to hear but barely dared believe. "We have found James. He is alive." Overcome with emotion, Joanne was speechless. High above the valleys, James lay beneath his rock shelter when he heard new sounds, voices. At first, he thought they were hallucinations, a cruel trick of hypothermia. But then came the crunch of boots on snow. He whistled weakly, and to his shock, a whistle echoed back. Moments later, 2 men crouched beneath his ledge and peered in. "Are you James Scott from Australia?" they asked. James nodded. The men rushed to him, embracing him with relief and joy. One rescuer, in awe, told him, "You're a god." When James asked why, the man explained, no one had ever survived in that part of the Himalayas for more than 10 days. James had endured 43. The following morning, a helicopter lifted him from the mountains. At the landing site, Joanne was waiting. When the chopper touched down and James stepped out, gaunt and filthy, she ran to him. They embraced tightly, clinging to one another as if the world had fallen away. She barely recognized him, but he was alive. And incredibly, the very place he was rescued was the exact spot the llama had pointed to on the map. This was more than a story of survival. It was a story of faith, determination, and the impossible triumph of the human will. James Scott had endured the unendurable and, against all odds, lived to tell the tale. So if this story of survival and hope inspired you, make sure to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more unbelievable true stories, and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next one. Stay safe, stay curious, and until next time, thank you for watching.